In this video I'll show you how to focus in landscape photography and importantly where to focus in your composition to get outstanding sharp photographs from the foreground to the distance. I will even show you different focusing methods I use by myself, and I will tell you exactly when I prefer which method over the other. I will also show you concrete examples and simple techniques I use by myself, what allows you to get really each of your photograph razor sharp all the time. Hi my friends, very nice to see you. Over the last 30 years I got lots of different questions about landscape photography, but one of the questions I get asked always and always again is how to focus and where to focus. And a quite important thing here is, generally in photography, that we should think about which parts of our composition we want to have in focus and which not. So in most genres of photography we usually prefer to have the focus point exactly at our most important point of the composition, what is usually the subject. And this allows us to bring isolation between our subject and the background. And it also helps to lead the viewer's eyes to the most important area. But in landscape photography it gets a little bit more complicated, to be honest, because there is not always a clear subject in front of a background. Especially in vista photography we usually want to get everything pin sharp from the foreground to the distance. So what we finally really want is a high depth of field, what covers our entire composition. If you should have experience with other genres of photography, you might know already that the focus point is not in the center of the focus layer, it is more in the first third of it. So from the point where the focus layer starts, there is 1/3 to the focus point and another 2/3 to the end of the focus layer in the distance. And so what I did in my usage is, this is already really long ago by the way, I always focused 1/3 into my composition because I thought that this would maximize my depth of field, because the focus layer reached from 1/3 in front of the focus point to 2/3 behind, and yeah, to be honest, I ruined so many photographs by using this focusing method. Either the foreground got blurry or the mountains in the distance got blurry, or both of them got blurry. Because what I didn't consider back then is, or what I simply just didn't know, that the sharpness inside the focus layer is not equally spreaded. We always have a focus point where we get, the maximum sharpness. And before as well as behind the focus point, within the focus layer, the sharpness gets lower and lower. And this is why I got sharp midgrounds but blurry foregrounds and blurry distance layers. And as it sometimes seemed to work, I thought it were maybe just a question of practice to estimate where the first third is and how far I have to close my aperture. It worked sometimes, but it never really led into fantastic results. I mean, they had worked on Instagram, but if you need higher resolutions, maybe for printing or something like this, at least for me it is really a big issue. So I tried lots of different things, but finally I stumbled over something what is called hyperfocal distance. And to be honest, that sounds really interesting for me, because focusing at the hyperfocal distance allows you to get out the highest depth of field. Hyperfocal distance, what a complicated word, isn't it? But it is super simple. You just have to know what is the closest point in your composition that you want to have sharp, and then you double the distance, you get to the hyperfocal distance. And this is the point we want to focus on. Super simple, isn't it? There's just one question open, which aperture we have to use. And therefore I use an app that is called PhotoBuilds. This is really a fantastic app with different useful functions for photography, and it also contains a hyperfocal distance table. And it is so easy to use. I just have to know the hyperfocal distance, what is given through my first sharp element in my composition, and I have to know my focal length, what I just have to read from a lens obviously. So finally, I just have to look into my table and I know exactly which aperture I have to use to get everything in focus. That's really cool, isn't it? There's just one thing. If you make a mistake on your estimation and you focus a little bit closer than the hyperfocal distance, it will not work. And your distance layer will get blurry. And this is not what I want, of course. But what I found out is over the years that I don't have the biggest problem when the foreground gets at least a tiny bit softer. And so what I finally always do when I use the hyperfocal distance method is I estimate the hyperfocal distance and then I add just a tiny bit of distance so that I focus a tiny bit behind the hyperfocal distance, just to get sure that I don't focus closer than the hyperfocal distance. But to be honest, finally, the hyperfocal distance method was not really the holy grail I hoped for. It was still too complicated for me. It also took me too long to be finished with focusing, and so I still ruined some of my photographs. But I didn't give up and I looked for a better solution. And finally I found out that when we break it down, there are just two things what are really important for sharpness in an image. Understanding these two things for me made everything totally clear about how I have to focus to get out the best possible results. And the first thing is a really simple question I ask myself. Why do we want to have everything sharp in our photographs, especially in Vista photographs? Good question, isn't it? And that's quite interesting. It has its origin in a time when we lived in caves. So when a Stone Age man, for instance, arrived at the location, obviously he wasn't there for photography. And so he just was interested in surviving. And so he scanned the landscape. And this means when he looked at the landscape, he just was interested if there might be any predators out there, or if the landscape had maybe potential that there could live some animals which he could hunt, or if there is potential for some fruits growing up, vegetables or whatever. Today we still tend to scan landscapes. This is just a primary instinct, something we always did, but back then just to ensure that we will survive. So finally this means for us we need to have everything pin sharp in our photographs so that our viewers are able to scan the landscape. So on the one hand we want to have everything pin sharp, but there is another aspect. And this is the second really important thing. What is not known in photography only, but also in painting. We want to lead the eyes of the viewer to the most interesting area in the composition. We can achieve this by different methods. Lines, shapes, contrasts and so on. I will not go into detail here, I think there will come an own video. But very important, our eyes are also drawn to sharper areas. So how can we combine these two aspects? On the one hand, everything should be sharp. On the other hand, we want to use a contrast of sharpness and unsharpness to lead the viewer's eyes. And the answer is something what I call micro-unsharpness. As already mentioned, I found out that I don't have a problem if the foreground is a tiny bit softer. Softer, not totally unsharp or even blurry, just softer. And finally, I really found a focusing method what is super simple, what doesn't ruin any of my photographs anymore, and what gives me just a tiny bit of softness in the foreground. And this is what I call distance focusing. Let's remember, the depth of field depends on the distance of our focus point. This means the more the focus point is in the distance, the bigger gets our depth of field. And so what I do is really simple. I pick out the furthest point in my composition that I want to have sharp, and I simply just focus on that point. And I close the aperture as far as necessary to get my wish depth of field. And so when we have a look at photo builds and I choose, let's say 16 millimeters at f16 and we choose infinity, 5000 meters for instance, we see that the closest point that will be sharp is at 54 centimeters. Finally, my distance layer will be pin sharp. Also my foreground will look pin sharp. In reality, it is a tiny bit, just a tiny bit softer. You remember, micro unsharpness. And this is the focusing method I use most of the time. Yeah, I mean, it is really super simple. I'm super fast with focusing and there's not much you can do wrong with it. There's just one thing. When we close the aperture too much, we get something that is called diffraction. And this means that the image gets blurry. Obviously, this is something we should avoid. What's happening here is the opening up the aperture gets so small that the edges start to scatter the light to the center of the lens and disturbs the light what is reflected from our composition to the sensor, and yeah, everything gets blurry. So we never should close the aperture too far. How far exactly depends on the lens you use. If you're unsure how far you can go, especially on your lenses, I made already a video about that where I show how you can find out. I will link the video up in the corner for you. So I always try to use this distance focusing method first because it is super simple, I'm really fast in focusing and it's the most safe method, to be honest. But just for the case that I closed the aperture already to the maximum, but it is still not enough, my foreground gets too blurry, what can we do? Well, in this case I have three options. One option in that case is focus stacking. Here I choose more focus points and I take more exposures. I finally just blend them in Photoshop. By the way, I mentioned this already in some of my videos, I was never the biggest friend of focus stacking because, guess why? The foreground gets too sharp. You remember? I prefer a tiny bit of softness in the foreground, just to support the viewer's eyes to get led into the frame. But meanwhile I developed the method how I get rid even of this issue and what makes focus stacking really useful for me. If you're interested in how to master focus stacking, just leave me a comment below, maybe there will come a video. However, a really important thing we should consider here is that focus stacking is not always possible, especially when there is moving anything in our composition, grasses in the wind, ripples or even waves in the surface of the water. In that case you can't stitch the exposures afterwards and yeah, your photos will be ruined. And this is why I prefer the hyperfocal distance method in that case. I don't get out the best possible sharpness through, but the sharpness is totally acceptable for me. But there's one thing. What if you are building up a composition and you see already that the light is coming or that the cloud is already exactly there where you want to have it in your composition? Well, if your camera has a crop mode, an APS-C mode or something like this, you could use just that crop mode. Focus on the distance and take the shot. Super fast, super simple. You know, crop sensors allow us to get a higher depth of field because, I mean, it's obvious, when we want to get the same composition like with a full frame sensor, we have to go more of distance with the camera. And yeah, of course you will lose megapixels in crop mode, but what is more important for you? A masterpiece with 18 megapixels only or 16 megapixels of rubbish? Well, this is how I focus, but there are some exceptions. So let me show you some photographs. This is a classic example for distance focusing. I focused at the right hand side of that right peak in the distance. With f14 everything got pin sharp from the foreground to the distance. No exceptions, a clear thing here. But let's have a look at another example. Well, on this photograph I made an exception. As there was haze in the air, it was not necessary to get even the mountain range in the distance totally sharp. In this case they have just a kind of background character. I just needed them for this layering effect, giving us a sense of depth, what is also given through this repetition of the mountains. And this is why I focused at this dominant peak here. This is the last point in my composition I want to get sharp. Everything behind it is anyway in the haze and a tiny bit of subtle softness just supports the story here. F14 and everything got sharp as I wanted. And here another example with an exception. As I even cut the waterfall in the distance, I wanted to have just a tiny bit of softness in the distance. The point of interest in this scene is the rock in the midground, and up from that rock formation back there, I even want to get a tiny bit of softness to the distance. And this is why I decided to focus on that rock back there. With F9 I got everything pin sharp with a tiny bit of softness in the distance. And here another example for distance focusing. I've gone into setup when the mist was a bit lower, just above the surface of the water. This is why I focused at the distance mountain behind the mist. Actually, it had been enough to focus just on the peak at the right, because this is the last point in my composition I needed to have sharp. That the mist finally raised was just fantastic, but no reason for me to focus again. F11 was enough here to get everything razor sharp, because I didn't have a closer foreground. And same here, by the way. As I focused at the distance here, the mist was higher, but in this case I would not move the focus point closer, also with the mist, because it was just a tiny bit of mist. Everything behind is clear to see. So this is one of the photographs of the frozen waterfall I've been recently. As I was really close to my foreground, I had to use the hyperfocal distance method, and this is where I focused with f16. To be honest, it had also been possible to use focus stacking instead, but I found the hyperfocal distance very quick in that case, and as I feared that I would come down one more snow slide. Yeah, if you haven't seen the video, I got nearly hit by a slide, so I was really on a rush here. Well, here another exception. My camera position was extremely close to the rocks here in the foreground. I tried to focus on the distance mountains with my maximum aperture, what was f/16 on this lens, but unfortunately it didn't work. The foreground got too soft here. And I saw that there appeared always some light spots there and where in the landscape, and so I knew that I had to be really quick. There was no time for multiple exposures, what I had needed for focus stacking, because the light spot moved around. And there was also no time for finding the hyperfocal distance, because yeah, in situations like that, the light could arrive each second. And finally I decided to move my focus point from the distance mountains a tiny bit closer, just to compensate the missing sharpness in the foreground. And yeah, that worked really fantastically here. I just had to wait for the right timing and I got this image what, yeah, I'm really happy about. So let's have a look at the next photograph. And in that case I was also very close to the rock at the left hand side. Stopping down to my maximum aperture didn't lead into the needed depth of field. Also here I tried to move my focus point a tiny bit to the front to compensate the missing sharpness in the foreground. And here unfortunately it didn't work. Yeah, I was too close to the foreground in that case, so I decided to focus stack. And so I focused at these 3 focus points and finally I just had to blend them in Photoshop. And here's something different. In this case I decided to focus on that tree with this, yeah, golden yellow foliage. I mean, in this scene it were possible to see more to the distance, but the trees back there are not my main characters of the composition. They just support the story by giving us a repetition to the far distance. So having them a bit softer just supports the story here, and this is why I finally decided to open up even to f5.6. Same here, by the way, we had fog in the distance. The main characters were these trees in the midground and also this big tree in the foreground. I focused at the tree in the midground and I needed f11 to get these trees in the midground as well as the tree in the foreground in focus. If I had focused on that first tree, it had been too blurry to the distance and even to the midground, because the depth of field depends on the distance of our focus point. Finally, it is all about thinking what we want to have as our sharpest areas in our photographs. On Vista photographs, for me, these are the distance mountains in most cases. In woodland photography and even waterfall photography, it depends a bit more on the composition and the story, of course. But generally, if you're unsure how to focus, distance focus works in most cases. And the very important thing is, independent on the focusing method you have chosen, always take a test shot and check if everything is sharp before you take your final exposure. My friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. If yes, I will really happy if you could give me a thumb up. Share this video with your friends on Facebook, Instagram. Give them also the chance to master their focus skills. Thank you so much for watching. See you next Saturday. Bye.
I'm the landscape you need to see. You are the artist I'll never be. Stay with me and I have no doubt you'll make a painting that makes you proud.